Hi, this is Heather Jerome from heatherjerome.com and from the Sonatas and Partitas.com. This video is the first video of a two-part series about the Adagio from the G minor sonata, BWV 1001. In this video, I want to discuss the sort of overall structure of the Adagio. I'm hoping that most of you have seen an earlier video that I've made that it's entitled Introduction Video, and it talks about the general philosophy of looking at the overall structure of a movement and how it works, and how in all of these pieces, almost all of these pieces, except this one, from the Sonatas and Partitas, Bach goes from his home key and then he makes his way to one new key, somewhere about 2/3 of the way through the piece, then he turns around and comes back home. But in this piece, when Frank Kuntz and I were first arranging these pieces and we were first learning about how to understand the long-range forms in Bach's structure, I couldn't actually find that little turning around place. And so I did it by math. I just added up the number of measures and I figured out which one was 2/3 of the way through, and it was measure 14. And I saw that actually from measure 14 to the end, there's 8 or 9 bars. That's an exactly transposed repeat of the first 8 or 9 bars. And a lot of people have written about that since then. I've noticed I a little bit rediscovered the wheel, but it's very interesting to look at this up close and see exactly where does Bach have an exact repeat, an exact transposition, and where it's just an ornamented transposition. The ornamented transpositions are really interesting because it can give us an idea of how we could ornament or repeat in the binary pieces. And then you look at the bass line and it's almost exactly transposed, but there are a couple of divergences. And if you look at the chord functions, like what's a 1, a 4, and a 5, those are also exactly the same, except for maybe 1 or 2. And so what's really interesting is to see where those divergences are and to ask ourselves, why did Bach change it? And especially when you're making a transcription of something and you're arranging it for a new instrument, if you're going to be adding some notes that Bach didn't add in, you really do want to understand the structure properly. And going through this process definitely opens a lot of doors and answers some interesting questions and leads you to being able to add in that right note if that's what you want to do. So that's what this video is about. I hope you enjoy it. As always, let us know what you think at sonatasandpartitas.com. Now I've pasted the transposed measure underneath the original one. So we have measure 14 underneath measure 1. And we can see that on both measures, the bass moves up by step. In measure 14, that C that I've got circled is also an implied bass note. If you were to play a full chord there, you would want a root position C minor chord. Now looking at the chords on beat 3, we can see they both have the same intervallic structure. And then you see that in measure 1, the G resolves down to F sharp, and in measure 14, the C resolves down to B natural. And then at B4, measure 14 is exactly transposed. Now while it's really interesting to look at these intellectually, the reason I'm making these videos is to help people as listeners and players. So let's have a listen to these two measures back to back. And now. Now here we have measure 2 and measure 15, and again we can see that the bass is transposed down a fourth. Now if you look at the melody, you can see that in measure 2 we have T do, and in measure 15 we have Fa mi. So in measure 2 we're basically still establishing the key of G minor, not just for this Adagio but for the whole sonata. So Bach has 1, 5, 1, and in the melody, the basic melody is do, ti, do. But in measure 15, we don't need to do a big, strong establishing of the key of C minor. We're just in C minor, and we're going to leave and head back to G minor. So the melody in measure 15 is Fa mi. And in the second beat, you can see that the figuration is basically the same. In measure 2, you have a decorated C. In measure 15, there's a decorated G. And then in the second half of the beat, there's that drop of a fourth in both parts. And the last beat is an exact transposition. So let's have a listen. And now measure 15. Now comparing measure 16 to measure 3, we can see that again the bass is exactly transposed, as is the first beat. The little melodic material in the second beat is in the inner voice while the G sustains. And then there's a little tail at the end of the fourth beat that's also exactly transposed. Now if you look at the end of beat 3 and the beginning of beat 4, I haven't circled it, but you can see that the figuration is very similar. So let's have a listen. And now here we have measure 4 and measure 17, and at the end of beat 2 there are two notes that are circled. Now the reason I did that is because the lower one is not actually Bach's note, it's ours, Frank Kuntz and mine, in our arrangements of the Sonatas and Partitas. So that F sharp in measure 4 actually matches up with the B natural in measure 17. So here's a situation, why didn't Bach do that? And there's a simple answer here, is that the F sharp is 1/2 step lower than the violin's lowest note. Now looking at the dotted circle at beat 3 and 4, it's just interesting to see that the melodic outline is the same, except that here it's transposed down a third instead of a fourth. So let's have a listen. And now. Now comparing measure 18 to measure 5, again the bass line is transposed. The melodic material in the first two beats is very much elaborated in measure 18. And then the chord at beat 3 has the same intervallic structure as it does at beat 3 in measure 5. It's just arpeggiated instead of played harmonically. And beat 4 is an exact transposition. So let's have a listen to these two measures. Now from here to the end I've written in some chord names just to make it easier to talk about. But you see at measure 19 there's a D7 with a C in the bass, and there are two notes circled there. So again, that C is a note that Frank Kuntz and I added. Bach only has the A and F sharp there. But if you look at measure 6, you can see there's a nice descending bass line. There's an A7 with the 7th in the bass, and it resolves to the third of the next chord, the F. And so you would ask yourself again, why didn't Bach do that at measure 19 and put that C in the bass? Well, here, I think the answer has to do with violin technique. In the Baroque period, they held the violin in the left hand. They didn't hold it in place with the chin. And so because of that, it was harder to shift, and they mostly did play in first position. So with the two notes that Bach wrote in, the A and the F sharp, that's the open second string and the first string way down in first position. If he wanted to add that C on the violin, players would have to move to the upper position, and the chord would require an awkward left hand contortion. Now there's another thing I'd like to address here. Looking at Bach's manuscript, you can see his A as a 16th note with the two little flags at the bottom. There are some people who have thought that those two 16th note flags were actually a D note. It's pretty easy to see when it's blown up that it is a 16th note, but there are some violin editions that actually have a D there. And there are also guitar players who play a D there. So just wanted to bring this to people's attention that if you are going to add a bass note, C is the correct note to add. So moving on, we can see that measure 19 at B2 is just a slightly elaborated transposition of what happened at measure 6. And then at beats 3 and 4, it's exactly the same, except that notice the slurring is different. So when you're playing it, make sure you articulate it differently. So let's have a listen. Okay, so now we're nearing to the end, and Bach is going to vary it a little bit. In the same way that at the beginning, when Bach was establishing his key of G minor, he had to make a bigger statement than when he was landing on C and going to head back to G minor. And here at the end, it's the same thing. He's arriving back to his home key, so he's going to make that a bigger gesture than when he arrived at the key of D minor where he needed to modulate. But let's have a look because it is still extremely similar. And looking at the chord names, we can see that it is transposed down a fourth. There's D minor to G minor, and then G minor down to C minor, and E diminished down to not A, but A flat. Looking at it a little bit more closely and not getting stuck on chords, because Bach actually didn't think in chords, that didn't exist then. He just thought of intervals above the bass. And so you can see that at beat 3, there's that C in the bass. And then if you go to the downbeat of the next chord, that C holds on and becomes the 7th of that D7 chord. So that's the Neapolitan. And that is the way that Bach always resolves his Neapolitan chords. Is there's the bass note, the Neapolitan has the third in the bass, in this case it's C, and he holds it over to the next chord, and it becomes what we call a 5-4-2 chord. I just think that's one of the wonderful things in this piece, how, in measure 7, there's D minor to G minor to E diminished, so it's what we would call 1 to 4 to 2. But then when he's making it into a bigger statement, he doesn't have 1 to 4 to 2, he has 1 to 4 to flat 2. And that flat 2 chord always is used to herald either a final cadence or a really important cadence. So there's another thing I'd like to look at in this measure, a real little piece of magic, I think. So if you look at measure 7, beat 2, you have a D minor chord, and then in the bass, there's a C. So that C is the 7th of the D minor chord. It doesn't actually sound like a dissonance because it's the interval of a major 6th. But it is a dissonant note, and it does want to resolve. And it does resolve to that B flat, like the 7th always does. It resolves to the 3rd of the following chord. But then as it resolves to that G minor chord, there's a B flat and an A natural together. That A is repeated as a dissonance for sure, and then that A resolves down to the G just 2 notes later. So you have this sort of double crunch, and that is what Bach uses at measure 7 to sort of herald, like, okay, we're getting close to something, like he's making it more intense, and then he's got his diminished chord, and then he's going to end up cadencing on his D minor. And at measure 20, what he's got is the Neapolitan chord to make it more intense, or make it more directed, I should say. So let's have a listen. And now the last 3 measures. Now there's one more thing I'd like to discuss. Looking at the manuscript here at measure 3, beat 2, Bach has E natural. Now if you look at his key signature, he's only got one flat, even though this piece is in G minor. So he has written it using the key signature of G Dorian, and then he put in all the E flats himself. That was something that was still done quite commonly in the Baroque period, harkening back to the old modal system. But here, if you look at measure 16, which is a transposition of measure 3, you can see that Bach has A flat, not A natural. Also, in the first 4 measures of this Adagio and of this whole sonata, Bach is establishing the key of G minor. So it would be so unlike him, while he's establishing his key and setting up his structure, to be taking a pot shot at G Dorian. So in my opinion, no matter which way you look at it, that note has to be E flat. Well, I hope you found this helpful. If you'd like to learn more, there is a part 2 video for this Adagio. Part 2 discusses this small transition section from where Bach has arrived at D minor, how he gets to C minor, where he can start his transposed repeat back down. There's some wonderful writing in those short little measures. And as always, feel free to ask questions on the website or let us know what you think at sonatasandpartitas.com.